The first thing I saw when I opened the police report was a chilling detail. The victim's apartment was eerily pristine, too pristine. It was as if someone had tried to erase every trace of what had happened. Every inch of the place had been scrubbed, wiped, and polished, yet something felt deeply off about it. The furniture was pushed neatly into place, the floors gleamed, and there wasn't a single speck of dust or debris. It was too perfect. The kind of perfect you only see when someone is desperately trying to cover their tracks. But despite all the care taken to erase the crime, one thing remained: an object so simple, so ordinary, it didn't belong. A yellow sock, neatly folded, tucked under the bed, out of place. Why had this sock been left behind, and what did it have to do with the woman's death? I looked closer at the details of the scene. The apartment was on the second floor of a nondescript building, nestled in a quiet neighborhood in Munich, Germany. Nothing extraordinary, nothing to hint at the horror that had unfolded within those four walls. The curtains were drawn, the TV was still on, just a low hum of static in the background. It felt like a home, a place someone might come back to after a long day, a place that should have been safe. But something was terribly wrong. The crime scene had been scrubbed almost clean. The blood that had been spilled was wiped away with disturbing precision, like someone had thought to clean up after themselves, too much so. But there it was, the sock. One bright yellow sock, folded and tucked carefully under the bed. And that's when it hit me. The sock wasn't just an accident. It was a message. It was deliberate. But whose message was it? Her name was Anna, a young woman in her early 20s, living alone in that apartment in the quiet neighborhood. She had a modest life, just enough to get by, nothing lavish. A simple existence, but a peaceful one, or so it seemed. Anna was a graphic designer working for a small local firm. She was introverted, reserved, and kept to herself for the most part. Her neighbors described her as friendly, but quiet, never drawing attention to herself. She didn't go out much, preferring the comfort of her home. Most of her days were spent sketching in her art books, designing digital graphics, or watching films in the evenings. On rare occasions, she'd venture out to visit a cafe or to meet a friend. But those moments were few. From what I gathered, Anna wasn't involved in anything that would attract unwanted attention. No drugs, no shady characters, no secret life that could explain why someone might want to harm her. Her friends described her as a gentle soul, someone who could be counted on for a kind word or a listening ear. There was nothing in her background that screamed danger or conflict, but I couldn't help but wonder, was there more to Anna than met the eye? A dark secret hidden beneath that calm exterior? Or had she simply been an innocent victim of a random, tragic event? As I sifted through the details of her life, something felt off. A woman like Anna, living quietly, without any known enemies, shouldn't end up dead in her apartment, her life violently snuffed out. The more I looked into her routine, the more I started to ask myself, why had this happened to her? What was it that had led Anna into the path of the killer? And why, out of all the things that could have been left behind, was it a yellow sock neatly folded under her bed? But on the night of her death, something was different. Anna had made plans to meet a friend for drinks, a rare occurrence for someone like her. It was supposed to be a casual evening out, just a couple of drinks at a local pub. Anna had seemed excited, a welcome change from her usual routine of staying in. Her friend, a woman named Lena, arrived at Anna's apartment at the agreed time. She knocked on the door. Nothing. She knocked again. Still no answer. Lena checked her phone, thinking maybe Anna was running late. She tried calling her, but it went straight to voicemail. Concerned, but not yet alarmed, Lena waited outside for a few more minutes before deciding to leave. Anna wasn't the type to stand someone up, especially not on such a rare occasion. But when Lena didn't hear from her by the next morning, worry began to creep in. Anna had always been reliable, always quick to respond, whether it was to a text or a call. This silence was uncharacteristic. Lena tried calling her again, but this time there was still no answer. Her unease grew, and by midday she decided to visit Anna's apartment in person. Perhaps Anna had gotten caught up with something, maybe an emergency, or simply fallen asleep after a long day. But what Lena didn't know was that she would soon find herself part of a chilling mystery. The following afternoon, after a sleepless night filled with unanswered texts and missed calls, the building manager received a call from another tenant. The neighbor had reported a strange smell coming from Anna's apartment, a musty, unpleasant odor that had grown stronger throughout the morning. When the building manager arrived and tried to open the door, it wouldn't budge. Alarm bells went off. He called the authorities, and a few minutes later, the door was forced open. What they found inside made their stomachs turn. The apartment, which had once been neat and lived in, was now cold and still. But what struck them most wasn't just the eerie silence, but the trail of blood leading from the living room to the bedroom. It was thick, dark red, staining the wooden floorboards in a jagged, unnatural path. The bedroom door was ajar. The officers cautiously stepped forward, their hearts pounding in their chests as they slowly pushed it open. Inside the bedroom, Anna lay lifeless on the floor, her body positioned unnaturally, as if tossed carelessly aside. Her pale face stared at the ceiling, eyes wide open, frozen in terror. The blood around her was stark against the white sheets of the bed, as if she had been dragged into the room after being struck. The scene felt like something out of a nightmare, each detail more disturbing than the last. Anna's lifeless form, the silence of the apartment, the blood that had been spilled, it was a vision no one could easily forget. And yet, the most unnerving detail was the way the crime had been cleaned up, almost as if someone had tried to wipe the slate clean, but had forgotten to remove one final piece: the yellow sock. It was there, tucked under the bed, and it was the only clue left behind. The authorities arrived quickly, but as they began their investigation, it was clear that the scene was not what they had expected. The apartment was meticulously cleaned, too clean. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken windows, no damaged locks. Everything appeared untouched, like someone had gone to great lengths to cover their tracks. The officers scanned the apartment for evidence, but everything seemed to be in place except for one thing: the sock, a single yellow sock tucked under the bed. Its color was too bright, too vivid, standing out against the otherwise neutral tones of the room. It didn't belong to Anna. It wasn't hers. In fact, it was almost unsettling how out of place it seemed. The sock was pristine, clean, and fresh, unlike anything else in the apartment. What made it even stranger was the fact that there was no label, no brand name, no size marker, nothing that could link it to any known store or product. It was just a simple yellow sock, but it felt deliberate, as if it had been planted there, left behind for someone to find. Why had it been tucked so carefully under the bed of all places? Had the killer left it behind on purpose, or was it some kind of mistaken afterthought in the midst of their crime? The more I thought about it, the more I realized that this sock wasn't just an object. It was a clue. The question was, what did it mean? The investigators began to piece together Anna's life, hoping to find some kind of connection that could explain her death. Her friends, family, and coworkers were all interviewed, but no one seemed to have any answers. They were all shocked. No one could think of a single person who would want to harm Anna. She had been a quiet, reserved woman who didn't seem to have enemies. Her closest friends described her as kind-hearted, introverted, but never involved in any kind of drama. She didn't have a boyfriend, and there had been no recent relationships in her life. There were no reports of arguments or conflicts, no known tensions with anyone. Her life, while solitary, was simple and seemingly free of complication. So why had someone taken her life? The lack of evidence, combined with the bizarre scene in the apartment, only deepened the mystery. There was nothing to suggest a break-in or robbery, nothing had been stolen. The apartment's pristine condition raised even more questions. It was as if someone had tried to erase any trace of the crime, but still they had left behind that one significant detail: the yellow sock. Was it a clue left by the killer, or just a random mistake? No one could explain it, and the more the investigators dug into Anna's life, the more they realized how little they truly knew about her. She kept to herself. She didn't open up much about her personal life. But this sock, this strange out-of-place sock, seemed to suggest something deeper, something hidden beneath the surface. Was it a sign that the killer knew her? Or was it just another part of a more twisted game? The sock was the only real clue they had, and it felt like the key to unraveling the entire case. But with no leads, no obvious suspects, and no real motive, the investigators were left to wonder. Was this yellow sock an answer, or just another puzzle to solve? As the investigation continued, things started to unravel in unexpected ways. The yellow sock, initially appearing to be a simple clue, began to raise more questions than answers. The investigators were led to focus on the apartment's previous tenants, suspecting that one of them might have some connection to the crime. After all, the sock had no obvious link to Anna. It was the only item in the apartment that didn't belong to her. So the team started digging into the apartment's history. The first lead came from a man named Thomas, who had lived in the apartment before Anna. He had vacated the premises more than 6 months ago, and there had been no known contact between him and Anna during her time in the apartment. At first, his connection to the case didn't make sense. He wasn't on anyone's radar. But then something strange emerged. Thomas had recently been spotted in the area. Why would he have returned to the neighborhood after all this time? The police couldn't find any reason for his presence, and there was no indication he had been in contact with Anna at all. But his reappearance seemed too coincidental to ignore. What was he doing in the area so close to the time of Anna's murder? Was there a connection between Thomas and the yellow sock? The investigators were left with one glaring question. Had Thomas been a part of something much darker than anyone had realized? Then came the breakthrough they had been waiting for. The yellow sock, it turned out, was linked to an odd, inconspicuous store located just a few blocks away from Anna's apartment. The store wasn't anything special, just a small, unremarkable shop that sold a variety of goods, including socks, scarves, and other basic clothing items. But what caught the investigators' attention was the discovery that this particular yellow sock had been purchased there, and what was even more troubling, it wasn't from any regular line of merchandise. The store owner, when questioned, confirmed that the sock had been sold recently, but it wasn't from the standard inventory. The store kept a log of all sales, and it turned out that the sock had been bought just 3 days before Anna's murder. It was strange that such a specific item, one that seemed so mundane, had become a crucial piece of evidence. The sock, which had no label, no brand name, and no size marker, was now firmly tied to this store. What made it even more unsettling was the fact that it hadn't been purchased in bulk or as part of a normal transaction. It stood alone, an isolated item bought just days before Anna's tragic end. This discovery began to cast a new light on the case. Who had bought that sock? Why was it the only one of its kind? And why was it left behind in Anna's apartment? The store owner had no idea who had bought it, but there was one thing they did know for certain. The date of purchase matched the time frame perfectly. The sock was now part of the timeline leading up to the murder. Was it a clue left intentionally, or was it part of something even more sinister? The investigators were no closer to understanding the full picture, but one thing was certain: the yellow sock was no longer just an oddity. It was a key to the mystery. The deeper the investigators dug, the more twisted and disturbing the story became. At first, Thomas seemed like an unimportant lead, just a former tenant with no obvious connection to Anna. But as they began to scrutinize his background, something far darker started to emerge. Thomas had a criminal history, nothing too extreme, but enough to raise concerns. He had once been caught for a minor breaking and entering charge years before. It was a petty crime, a lapse in judgment, nothing that would have suggested a dangerous pattern of behavior. But as the investigators dug deeper into his past, they found more troubling details. Thomas had a history of strange behavior. Neighbors and friends described him as an odd, unpredictable man, someone who never seemed to fit in. He had no close friends and was often seen talking to himself in public. There were accounts of him visiting the local park late at night, lurking near the trees, staring off into the distance. Nothing overtly criminal, but certainly unsettling. Still, there was nothing that directly linked him to Anna or to her murder until the forensic examination of his possessions. The team had obtained a warrant to search his home, and that's when they found something that sent chills down their spines. Inside his apartment, the police discovered an unusual collection, several plastic bags, each containing different socks. These weren't just any socks, they were a mix of colors and styles, none of them ordinary. Some were brand new, some were clearly worn, and others had been meticulously washed and preserved. What was most bizarre, however, was the way they had been stored. Each sock was carefully labeled with a date. Thomas had kept track of every sock, treating them like artifacts. It wasn't until the investigators saw this collection that they realized the true nature of his obsession. What had initially seemed like an innocent lead now appeared to be a chilling compulsion. The discovery inside Thomas's home took a darker turn when the team began to examine the individual socks more closely. The collection wasn't just random, it had purpose, a twisted sort of organization. Among the socks, there was one that stood out, a yellow sock. This was no ordinary sock. It had been carefully removed from its plastic bag and placed on the floor in the living room. But what made it truly sinister was that this yellow sock, the one that matched the sock found in Anna's apartment, had recently been added to the collection. Thomas's obsession with socks was more than just a peculiar habit, it was a compulsion. As the investigators continued to dig into his life, they found that Thomas had been buying socks for years, hoarding them, cataloging them like trophies. Some of the socks in his collection were linked to incidents of strange behavior he had exhibited in the past, like following women in parks or showing up at local stores for hours just staring at the sock displays. But the yellow sock, the one he had placed in Anna's apartment, was different. It wasn't like the others. It seemed deliberately chosen. The timing of the purchase and the sock's deliberate placement in Anna's home sent a clear message. It wasn't just a random act, it was a calculated move. The sock had been left behind on purpose, as a signature of sorts. Thomas, it seemed, had been obsessed with Anna, and perhaps even with other women, for a long time. The yellow sock wasn't just a piece of evidence, it was part of his ritual, a final mark left on his victim. The investigators now had a clearer picture of the man they were dealing with. But what had driven him to take Anna's life? What had set him off that night? The questions only grew darker. But that wasn't all. As the investigation progressed, more disturbing revelations came to light. A search of Thomas's phone uncovered a string of unsettling messages. There, in the deep recesses of his text conversations, were several attempts to contact Anna. He had messaged her multiple times, trying to arrange a meeting, though she had never responded or even acknowledged his messages. At first glance, these messages appeared to be innocuous, a simple request to meet for coffee or a casual get-together, but the frequency and persistence of them were deeply unsettling. Anna, who had always been a private person, had clearly ignored his advances. But Thomas had kept trying, sending message after message, pushing her boundaries. The messages were filled with a strange sense of entitlement, as if he felt he was owed a piece of Anna's time. Each message grew more insistent, more desperate, until it became clear that Anna's refusal had triggered something in him, a deep, dark obsession. He wasn't just a man who wanted to be friends. He was someone who believed that she owed him attention, owed him something more. This wasn't the first time Thomas had crossed the line, he had done so before. But now it seemed that Anna's refusal had pushed him into a dangerous territory. The messages weren't just casual inquiries anymore, they were demands, veiled threats. But still, Anna had not responded. As the investigation unfolded, it became abundantly clear that Anna was not just an unfortunate victim in a random act of violence. She had been specifically targeted. This wasn't a crime of opportunity. Anna had been the latest in a series of events, dark, twisted events that had taken place over several years. Thomas wasn't just stalking her, he had stalked others before her. Anna was his most recent victim, but he had been setting the stage for something like this for a long time. He had a pattern. It was almost like clockwork. He'd find a woman, observe her for weeks, learning her habits, becoming familiar with her routine. Then he'd wait for the perfect moment when she was most vulnerable, most likely to trust him. He'd manage to convince her to let her guard down. That was his trick, making them feel comfortable, safe before striking. Anna was no different. She had likely let him into her life unknowingly, thinking he was just another acquaintance. She didn't see the danger until it was too late. On that fateful night, Thomas entered Anna's apartment. How he got in, we still don't know for sure. Did he have a key, or did he find another way? The details of that night remain clouded in darkness. What we do know, however, is that once inside, he attacked her savage and brutal. It wasn't a crime of passion, but one that had been planned for months. He had stalked her, studied her, and when he finally struck, there was no mercy. Anna had been attacked with a blunt object, likely a hammer or a heavy piece of furniture. Her body was found sprawled on the floor, her blood staining the carpet beneath her, leaving a chilling testament to the violence she had endured. What was perhaps the most haunting part of the crime, though, wasn't just the act itself, but the cold calculation behind it. Once Anna had been struck down, Thomas had taken the time to clean the apartment, to erase his presence from the scene. He wanted to make sure no evidence of his identity remained. But there was one thing he couldn't control: the sock. The yellow sock placed deliberately under her bed, as if he had left it there for a reason. It was a final, disturbing touch. Was it a signature, a calling card, or something more? It was as though the sock was a part of his ritual, a last trace of his presence. He had left it behind for someone to find, perhaps to taunt the police, or perhaps as a mark of ownership over Anna. But in the end, it became his undoing. The sock, which seemed so innocuous at first, now stood as the key to unraveling everything. It wasn't just an accident, it was deliberate. It was Thomas's signature, his mark on the crime, and it was the clue that would lead investigators straight to him. The police pieced together Thomas's movements, slowly putting the puzzle together. After the brutal attack on Anna, he had taken his time to clean the crime scene with disturbing precision. He had scrubbed every surface, wiped down every inch of the apartment, and ensured that no trace of his presence remained. It was as though he was trying to erase every sign of what had happened to make it look like a perfect crime. But in a bizarre moment, there was one thing he couldn't bring himself to: remove the yellow sock. The sock had been left behind, tucked carefully under Anna's bed. Why? Was it a mistake? A slip-up in his otherwise calculated plan? Or was it something more sinister? The more the police looked at it, the more it began to feel like a calling card, an unmistakable sign that Thomas had left behind intentionally. Perhaps it was a twisted signature, something he could claim as his own. After all, the sock didn't fit in with the rest of the scene. It was the one piece of evidence that didn't match his obsessive cleaning, the one thing that remained untouched by his frenzy. It seemed almost like a final trace of his obsession, a mark left behind in a place that he had spent so much time, a place where he had stalked and studied his victim. The sock, so simple and ordinary in appearance, was in fact a glaring clue. It was the key to unraveling his involvement. The police had no doubt that Thomas had been inside Anna's apartment, but the question remained: why had he left the sock? It was the one detail that didn't make sense, and yet it was the thing that would eventually unravel everything. The case seemed solved. Thomas was arrested and charged with Anna's murder. The evidence against him was overwhelming: the messages, the sock, the strange obsession with her. It all pointed to him. The yellow sock had become the pivotal clue, and it seemed like the investigation was finally drawing to a close. But there was still something unsettling about the way things had played out. It didn't feel as neat as it should have. There was a nagging feeling in the back of my mind that something didn't quite add up. The more I thought about it, the more I started to question the sock. It seemed too perfect, too planted. It was almost as if it had been left there on purpose, not by an impulsive killer, but by someone who was playing a far deeper game. It had been left with such deliberate care, almost like a trap, waiting for someone to notice it. Was it truly a mistake? Or had Thomas, who had gone to such lengths to cover his tracks, left it behind as part of a more elaborate plan? Was this yellow sock more than just a careless mistake, or was it the key to something darker, something that still wasn't fully understood? I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this than met the eye. Perhaps the truth wasn't as simple as it seemed. Maybe the sock was just the beginning, a hint at something far more twisted lurking beneath the surface. Could it be that Thomas wasn't the only one involved in Anna's death? Or had the sock been planted by someone else, someone who was still out there, watching from the shadows? As I stared at the case files late one night, a final, unsettling thought crossed my mind. It was a thought I couldn't shake, no matter how hard I tried to dismiss it. Could this yellow sock have been planted to throw off investigators? I couldn't ignore the possibility. Everything about it seemed so perfectly out of place. It was as if someone had carefully positioned it, left it there to create a trail, a path that would lead the investigators right to Thomas. But what if Thomas wasn't the true killer? What if someone else had used him as a pawn in a much bigger game? Had Thomas really been the one who murdered Anna? Or was someone else still out there, lurking in the shadows, watching and waiting for the right moment to strike again? The more I thought about it, the more I realized how little I truly knew. What if Thomas had been the victim of a setup, a carefully crafted plan designed to make him the perfect suspect? What if there was another player in this twisted game, someone who had orchestrated everything from behind the scenes? The more I thought about it, the more the pieces didn't seem to fit. There was something about Thomas, his obsession with socks, his strange behavior, that made him an easy target for suspicion. But what if he was just a red herring, a decoy meant to divert attention from the real killer? The questions kept swirling in my mind, and with every answer I found, more questions emerged. The sock, so simple, yet so complex, remained the key to unraveling this mystery. But had it been left there by Thomas or by someone else entirely? The thought gnawed at me, leaving me restless and uncertain. The more I examined the details of the case, the more questions I had. The sock, this seemingly innocuous item, was a key piece of evidence, yet it felt almost too obvious. It was so glaring, so perfectly placed. Could Thomas have been trying to lead investigators down the wrong path? Was he so confident in his obsession, so sure that the sock would be linked to him, that he left it deliberately as a sign of his involvement? Or was it simply a careless mistake, a moment of oversight in a crime he had planned so carefully? Each theory seemed plausible in its own right. The sock had been left behind with such intent that it almost felt like a clue, but one too obvious to be real. If Thomas had left it on purpose, then why not leave other clues? Why not make the scene even more suspicious, draw more attention to himself? Or had it been a panic-driven slip-up, something he hadn't meant to do but could never erase? It was a possibility. But then again, what if it wasn't Thomas at all? What if the sock had been planted by someone else? Someone who was manipulating the investigation from behind the scenes? That question lingered in the air, unanswered. The more I delved into the case, the more elusive the truth seemed. It was as if the answers were always just out of reach, slipping through my fingers like sand. The sock, so simple and yet so loaded with meaning, was the key to everything. But whether it would unlock the full mystery, well, that was a question I didn't have an answer to. Not yet. The investigators spent weeks piecing everything together, but with every passing day, the case seemed to grow murkier. They had their prime suspect. They had Thomas. His obsession, his criminal history, the messages to Anna, and the bizarre socket all pointed toward him. They had enough evidence to make an arrest, to charge him with Anna's murder. Yet something didn't sit right. There was a lingering doubt, a sense that the story wasn't as straightforward as it appeared. The sock, that yellow sock, had become the linchpin of the investigation. It was the one piece of evidence that tied everything together. But did it really? Was it possible that there was more to this story, something deeper lurking beneath the surface? The investigators were starting to question if the sock itself contained a deeper meaning. Was it a symbol of Thomas's obsession, a twisted signature left behind to mark the crime, or was it a clue to something else entirely? As the investigation dragged on, they began to wonder if the sock was simply the work of a mind unraveling, a killer who wanted to leave a trace, to leave something that would haunt investigators long after the crime was solved. But then there was that nagging feeling. Was this sock, this seemingly insignificant object, more than just a signature? Was it something that could explain everything? The answers weren't clear, and with each new discovery, more questions seemed to arise. The more they learned, the more the mystery deepened. I could feel the weight of the case bearing down on me. The more I examined the details, the more it consumed me. The socket seemed to hold all the answers, yet somehow it never felt like enough. Could it hold the key to unraveling this entire mystery, or had I too become obsessed just like Thomas? Had I let the simple act of finding a yellow sock cloud my judgment? The more I thought about it, the more I wondered if I was getting too close to the obsession that had overtaken Thomas. Was I chasing something that wasn't there, caught in a spiral of questions that couldn't be answered? Maybe in the end, it wasn't the sock that mattered. Maybe the truth was something deeper, something darker, and still hidden beneath the surface. Something I hadn't seen yet, something that couldn't be uncovered through simple clues or evidence. The sock may have been the key, but what if it was just part of a much larger story that I was missing? What if the real truth was even more horrifying than we could imagine? Was this a perfect crime, one that had been carefully orchestrated, leaving behind only a small trace to taunt the investigators? Or is the truth still out there, waiting to be uncovered, hidden in the shadows, waiting for someone to see it? The more I thought about it, the more I realized that this story, like so many others, may never have a clean ending. The sock, the obsession, the murder, everything felt like a carefully constructed puzzle, one that might never truly be solved. But one thing was certain: someone, somewhere, still held the answers. And until those answers were uncovered, the mystery of the yellow sock would linger unresolved, haunting those who dared to search for the truth.